my left, maybe your right, in this direction.
Okay, we're going to the right.
My name is John Ermold. I'm a volunteer tour guide / docent. Docent's a museum term, means tour guide. And, so anyway, if you have any questions during the next hour or so, please feel free to ask your questions, and I'll do my level best to answer your questions. And if you know something about the subject we're talking about, in fact, I was just talking to one lady who saw the video about the Ghost Army. So if you know something about a subject that we're talking about, please feel free to bring it up, because I like to learn from these tours myself. All right, well, Ghost Army. We're going to be talking about war, deception, and art. Now, war and deception have gone together forever. Art, that's a different term to be used with war and deception. So think about that. We're going to talk about why art fits in with war and deception in a few minutes. But back to war and deception, 1777, for example, George Washington and his Continental Army. They were facing a British army near Princeton, New Jersey, and George Washington left about 400 members of his Continental Army at their camp, and he told those 400 members to keep the campfires burning and continue to dig trenches and the like, and to deceive the British, because he took the rest of the army, about 4,000 members, on an all-night march around the British, and the next morning he was at the rear of the British Army, and they attacked the British Army, and they surprised them. So deception creates surprise, like George did, and surprise is an advantage in war. Okay? Deception and war. Now the Ghost Army, my opinion, is a nickname. Their formal name is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And I'll be using those two names interchangeably, Ghost Army, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They were given the mission, and their sole mission in World War II was to deceive the Germans. It's the only time in U.S. military history that a unit has been given that sole mission of deception. They were never given the mission to attack or defend. They didn't have the weapons to attack or defend. They had their individual weapons. They were issued their rifles or pistols. The largest weapon they had was a 50 caliber machine gun, which couldn't even penetrate the armor on a German tank. They were a top secret unit. In the government classification system, if you're not familiar with it, you start off with unclassified, where you can talk about anything with anybody. And then you go up to confidential, where you have to be a little more selective in who you talk to and what you say to the person. Then it becomes more restrictive and secret. And then top secret is the highest level. You've got to be very careful about who you talk to and what you say. They were a top secret unit. So these folks, 1,100 members of this unit, they couldn't even tell their parents what they were doing. Couldn't tell their girlfriends or wives what they were doing. In fact, we'll talk about a couple examples on the tour where they actually had to lie to some of their friends about what they were up to. In Germany, Europe, theater. Oh, we're going to be talking about walking through France, into Luxembourg, Belgium, and then finally into Germany. All right, so it's 1,100 members. So we're going to start right over here and break down those 1,100 members into 4 components. About 300 of them, 296, were the signal company. These were the folks that were communications people. They operated the FM radios, and they also operated Morse code equipment. Now, Morse code, as many of you know, is a dying technology, but in World War II is used quite a bit, particularly at higher level commands, like between divisions to corps to Army communication. In fact, we have some Morse code equipment you'll see later on in the tour. But these 296 individuals that operated the FM radios and Morse code equipment, they were individually selected based upon their skill and their experience in operating communications equipment. The second component of the Ghost Army was the combat engineer company. There's about 150 of these individuals. They had two purposes, the combat engineers. One was to provide the perimeter security for this top secret unit. When they're in France, for example, they're a top secret unit. You just can't have French farmers walking through this top secret area. So they provided that perimeter security. The combat engineers also provided the equipment necessary to, for example, dig trenches, which they would hide in when they were receiving artillery rounds. They would also create the ruts in the road. If you're trying to convince the Germans you have real tanks, you got a dirt road or a field, you better put ruts in the road or the field to try and convince the Germans if they're overflying and spying on you that you actually have tanks in there. So that was their purpose, their two purposes. Now over here on the other side, you'll follow me over here. This signal service company, these are the folks, I refer to them as the sound guys. There was about 150 of these individuals, and they're the ones, they are the ones that would create the sounds of tanks moving, of soldiers working, sounds of trucks moving, tanks moving into position, tanks moving out of position. We're going to talk a lot more about how they recorded these sounds and then broadcasted them over speakers. We'll do that in a few minutes. The fourth and final element is the camouflage inflatable folks. There was about 400 of these individuals. So it was the biggest element. 400 of the 1,100 were the camouflage inflatable folks. And they would create, and they would take the inflatables like you see. This is a replica, one here behind you. This is a replica of a 155 millimeter howitzer artillery piece. Now, none of the original inflatables have survived the test of time. So it is a replica, 1/3 of the size of the real inflatable. These inflatables were made in the U.S. We'll talk more about the manufacturing in a minute. But the inflatables included a series of smaller inflatable tubes, kind of like bones in our body, okay, making up our skeleton. So they had these smaller inflatable tubes, and then the smaller inflatable tubes would be wrapped in synthetic rubber. And synthetic rubber is the same material that divers use in their wetsuit. So it's waterproof. And so the inflatable tubes would be wrapped in this synthetic rubber. One of the reasons they opted for the smaller inflatable tubes to make up the skeleton of each inflatable is because if one of those smaller tubes got hit by a bullet or shrapnel from an artillery round, they could go out and repair the small inflatable tube and then reinflate it pretty quickly. Whereas if you had one big inflatable, one big balloon, and it got hit with an artillery piece, it all falls to the ground, go out and repair it. And then for a tank inflatable, for example, it would take 30 to 40 minutes to reinflate a tank inflatable. An inflatable like this probably took 20 to 30 minutes to reinflate. So that's why they went with small inflatable tubes, because they can reinflate the damaged inflatable tube pretty quickly. All right, get the picture of the inflatable tubes? All right. Now the other component of this 400-member segment of the Ghost Army, about half of them in this area were artists. Here I'm back to this term art. And a lot of them went to Pratt Art Institute up in Brooklyn, New York. A lot of them, some of them came out of professional illustrators, for example, for newspapers and magazines, things of that nature. So why do you think this unit had 200, almost 200 members were people that were trained in art or professionals? Why do you think that was?
They could show things that people wouldn't look for.
Sir?
They could show things that people wouldn't look for.
There you go. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
I read that.
Yeah, he's got the answer. All right. Yeah, they're artists. They pay attention to detail. They're creative. And so that seemed to be a good fit for the Ghost Army. In fact, as we walk around, you will see along the walls some of their sketch and artwork. And what they would do, these 200 or so members, many of them would, when they had a break in the action, they would open up their sketchbooks or bring out their painting supplies, and they would sketch what they were looking at. Over on this wall, I know that we're going to walk past it in just a minute or two. Over on this wall, I know there's sketches of bombed out churches. The guys would make a sketch of what Normandy, the beach where the invasion took place of Europe, what Normandy looked like on D-Day +8. There's paintings of churches, so on and so forth. So you'll see those as we walk around. So many of them were artists. You'll see them as we walk around. So the unit finally came together in January 1944. Let's do a time check real quick. We got involved in U.S. got involved in World War II because of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. So the U.S. was already at war for almost a little over 2 years before this unit was even formed. January of 44, it all came together. And when you think about it, January 44 is less than 6 months before the invasion of Europe, June 6, 1944. So things are going to start happening pretty quickly. And we're going to walk right around here or through there, right over there, to talk about what they did during their training. Okay, so this unit was formed up in January 1944, over 2 years after we got involved in a war. And the sound guys, the sonic folks, they went to Pine Camp, New York. And Pine Camp, New York was the headquarters in World War II of the Army Experimentation Station, which was appropriate because nobody knew if this sound idea was going to work to deceive the Germans. So the sound guys went to Pine Camp, New York. The rest of them we'll talk about where they went in just a minute. Colonel Rayleigh was the commander of the Pine Camp, New York station. By the way, if you're familiar with New York, Pine Camp is now Fort Drum, New York. If you're familiar at all with that area. Now I'm going to ask you to follow me around the other side of this so we can talk about where the other three elements went. Have some pictures. All right. The other three components of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, they went to Camp Forest, Tennessee. And Camp Forest, Tennessee is now the home of Arnold Air Force Base. It's down in southern Tennessee near the Alabama border. And so they got down there, they formed up in January. They had the difficulty of being the first unit of its kind to ever be formed. So therefore they had no training manuals, they had no training processes to follow from previous units like them. If that wasn't tough enough to deal with, being the first of its kind, they didn't even have the inflatables yet in January 44. So they didn't have the inflatables until they got to England, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Well, so they did the best they could without the inflatables. What they did was they rigged up dummies using wood, burlap bags, canvas, whatever they could find, and then they would camouflage them, and a plane would go overhead, a spotter plane, and they would then provide feedback as to how they were doing, how well they were doing, and what they could do better in camouflaging their dummies. So, Camp Forest, Tennessee. All right, you can see what they were doing there. Now so they went through this training, formed up in January, February, March, and April. And by the way, not only were the inflatable guys there, I mentioned the radio guys were down there, so they could initially start working together as a team. The radio guys sending out false messages, the camouflage guys working with the radio guys about we're moving tanks into position. The radio guys would then work with them, sending out those false messages, practicing what they would do when they were actually in combat over in Germany. But we'll talk more about that. All right, now I'm going to walk back over here because in May of 44, they break camp and they head to the East Coast and they get on ships headed to England. to participate right after the D-Day invasion. Now, this was not a Carnival cruise. Many of them wore life preservers because there was German U-boats, submarines lurking in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 3,000 U.S. and Allied ships were sunk by the Germans during World War II, just in the Atlantic. Think about that, 3,000 ships sunk. And so U-boat threat was very real. So a lot of them wore their life preservers all the way over to England. It took about 2 weeks from the east coast of the United States to get to their port in England. Fortunately, they all survived safe and sound. Once they got to England, they participated in Operation Fortitude, Unit did. And Operation Fortitude had been going on for some time in England. This was an operation to deceive the Germans as to where the real invasion would take place. Operation Fortitude was setting up a fake army under the command of General George S. Patton, and they were deceiving the Germans that the invasion of Europe was going to take place at the closest point between England and France, which is about a 20-mile gap across the English Channel between the White Cliffs of Dover and the Pas-du-Calais area of France. And the Ghost Army then, they got their inflatables when they arrived in England, so they started practicing with their inflatables. Now again, we're less than a month before D-Day. Okay, so time's really moving here. And so they started practicing for the first time with their inflatables in England in concert with Operation Fortitude, trying to convince the Germans that the invasion was going to take place at that close point between England and France. Well, we know from history the invasion took place in Normandy, which is about 200 miles south of that closest point between England and France. June 6, 1944 is when the invasion of Europe took place. All right, we're going to head over here now and talk about Normandy. Okay. As I mentioned, the invasion was initiated on June 6, 1944. On D-Day +7, June 13th, Lieutenant Colonel Mason with the 23rd Headquarters Special Troop, he was sitting in a pub having a pint of beer, appropriate, and then all of a sudden somebody came in and told Lieutenant Mason he needed to get back to his unit because the next day Lieutenant Mason and about 15 of his colleagues with artillery inflatables, like you see there, and here's a picture of a real one, real inflatable. They were sent to Normandy the very next day. And the reason why Lieutenant Mason and these artillery inflatables and these guys went to Normandy is because their task was to set up right next to a real U.S. artillery unit to deceive the Germans that there was more artillery there than the Germans thought, and to take some of the incoming artillery off of the real artillery unit, U.S. artillery unit, onto themselves. And that worked. They were able to do this because not only because of their inflatables, but because they would take empty shell canisters. They put about a half a pound of black powder in the shell canister, ignite the powder, and you would see the flash like artillery round coming out. They would do this in conjunction with the real artillery barrage, so you would have the sound effect of the artillery coming out. And it did deceive the Germans because they started receiving incoming fire. And we'll talk more about casualties within the Ghost Army in just a few minutes, which were few in number. All right, well, follow me over here to this corner. Talk about some of these sketches. The Ghost Army, along with many other U.S. and Allied units, were tasked with the mission of processing displaced persons. Now, a displaced person could be somebody that was just released from a concentration camp. It could be somebody that was running with his family from the war to get away from the fighting and the artillery and everything. Displaced person could be an individual that was forced by the German army to leave their country and come to Germany and perform slave labor for the Third Reich. And there was hundreds of thousands of these displaced persons at the end of the war. But the Ghost Army was tasked with processing displaced persons, and they actually displaced about 100,000 individuals in the 6-week period after the war. They were mainly, the displaced persons that the Ghost Army dealt with were mainly Russians that were put on trains headed back to Russia. And many of the Russian displaced persons did not want to go back to Russia. They were fearful of Stalin and his government. They were fearful that they would be accused of collaborating with the Germans. And they feared for their lives, that they would be shot for collaborating with the Germans. And so a lot of them feared going back to Russia, but they were forced onto trains and headed back. These are the sketches of some of those displaced persons that one of the Ghost Army guys did before they were sent back to Russia. Pretty good sketches. All right, that was, and then at the end of that 6-week period of time, then the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops came back to the United States after the war was over. All right, now I'm going to step over. Well, the horseshoe is just, it was a lucky horseshoe that he mounted on his jean. He just kept it as a lucky piece. Just a lucky piece. The same guy that did the sketches, that was his lucky horseshoe. All right, I'm going to bug everybody. He was the operations officer for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. He and his staff were the ones that put together the detailed plans of what each of the components would do. In other words, it's like a script in a movie. You would have to have plans for what the inflatable guys were going to do, where they set up their artillery pieces, where they set up their inflatable tanks. The communication back to their tanks were in place, reporting back to the company commander. The radio guys would have to, interject there at certain points in time, like a movie script. So he and his staff would put together those detailed plans for each of the operations. And we're going to talk about several of their operations in just a minute. Lieutenant Colonel Simonson, he was a West Point graduate, and he was disappointed when he found out that he was assigned as operations officer for these bunch of dummies, bunch of inflatables. He was trained, he's a West Point graduate. He was trained to lead in combat. So he was disappointed with his assignment. But from everything I read, he did an excellent job with his staff in making sure all this worked together like a movie script. And by the way, he did, in further reading about Lieutenant Colonel Simonson, he did get his wish for a combat command right at the end of World War II, and then again in Korea in 1950, 1953. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Simonson and his staff included this young lieutenant, Fred Fox. And Lieutenant Fox was a Princeton graduate, very bright guy. And after their first operation, which was Operation Elephant, once they got over into France, they realized they made some mistakes. And so they wanted to correct those mistakes. For example, they didn't issue the orders out fast enough to, the signal guys, the sonic guys. So they wanted to correct those mistakes, and they did. Lieutenant Fox came up with the idea of another tool called atmosphere, creating an atmosphere of special effects. And what that meant was another tool that they would use to deceive the Germans. If they were going to pretend to be, let's say, the 2nd Armored Division, then they would take on the appearance of the 2nd Armored Division. In other words, the commander of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, Colonel Reeder, would wear 2 stars on his shoulders, being the division commanding general. Okay, and we'll talk more about regimental commanders wearing full eagles on their shoulders. So they would take on their look. They would also stencil their vehicles to designate the unit that they were pretending to be. If they were replacing pretending to be the 2nd Armored Division, and the 2nd Armored Division sent a truck out to get ammo every day at 9 o'clock, they would send a truck out every day at 9 o'clock to get ammo or get mail or whatever. So they really wanted special effects and create an atmosphere that's what that they were taking on the role of who they were pretending to be. Just another tool along with sound, the inflatables, and the radios. All right? Lieutenant Fox. By the way, reading further about Lieutenant Fox, after the war, he got out of the military at the end of World War II, and he was on President Eisenhower's, he was an advisor to President Eisenhower when President Eisenhower was in the White House. So he must have been a pretty bright guy to have all that happen, Lieutenant Fox. All right, I've talked enough about sound. Now you probably want to listen to the sound of a tank. Here's the sound of a tank moving. Sound of a truck. We're going to talk about how they recorded this in just a second. Troops working, soldiers working, maybe complaining. Building a bridge, portable bridge, sound recording. The way they would do this, back when they were at Pine Camp, New York, they worked with technicians from Bell Laboratories. And they would record it just like a record would be recorded in the 1940s. All right, then they would take this record and they would use what was then cutting-edge technology called multi-channel recording. So they'd take these various recordings and put them into a multi-channel recording. And then they would put it into technology at that time was a wire recorder, just like over here with this gentleman standing. Wire spools, little 16-inch diameter wire. And the wire recorder was technology in the mid-40s, early 40s. Today, it's been replaced by what you know as tape recorders. All right? So that was the tape recorder back in those days. So they take these multi-channel recordings, put it on this wire recorder, then they would mount the wire recorder on a vehicle such as you see here. And there was 18 of these vehicles within the 23rd. There was three members on each vehicle. The driver was also tasked with the responsibility of explosives. He would be trained to blow up the vehicle in case they were ever overrun or feared of being captured. Fortunately, that never happened, but they didn't want the Germans, if they were ever captured, they didn't want the Germans to know what this vehicle was meant for. So the driver was trained to blow them up. Fortunately, again, they never had to do that. The second member of each crew was the radio operator and the gunner. The radio operator would communicate, say they were in position, whatever, with the higher headquarters. The radio operator also was trained to operate the 50 caliber machine gun. So each vehicle had a 50 cal on it. 18 total vehicles, 18 machine guns. Then the third person on each track, half track actually, the third person on each half track was the sound guy. And he would be the person that would then crank this large speaker up, 500-pound speaker, crank it up from its stowed position, and then they would start blasting the sound out toward the Germans. The sound of tanks moving into position, trucks moving, whatever. And these sounds could be blasted out for 15 miles, depending upon weather and terrain. These speakers were state-of-the-art. They actually were developed in conjunction with the Army and with Harvard University scientists. And each one, as I said, weighed 500 pounds. So when they got ready to move, and that guy would crank it back down into a stowed position, and then they would move to their next location. Any questions about the sound recording, just kind of like a record onto a wire recorder, tape recorder? Over here you see the German flag, the swastika from the Third Reich. This ended up in the hands of a young soldier within the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Not sure how he obtained it, but he got it. And he started writing on it the different locations that they were. And they moved across France and then Luxembourg, up into Belgium, and then finally in Germany. He started writing on it different locations. He also had some of his colleagues within the 23rd sign their names to it. So that's what you'll see on this German flag. So I think for me, as I look at this, that jumps off with two stories. One, the evil of the Third Reich with the swastika, and also then the path to liberation, the various towns that they went to liberating, Europe from the German regime, and the individuals that did that. Yeah, the path to liberation and the evilness of the German Third Reich. We'll step over here now.
What did it have to come to fight these bills?
Sir?
What did it have to fight these bills out in the field?
Oh, they have
compressors?
Yes, sir. Exactly. Yep, compressors. Good question. Thank you. I want to mention, question comes up occasionally, how did this all get started? Who came up with this idea about having this unit to deceive the Germans? And several different sources for that. One of them was Douglas Fairbanks Jr., movie actor, movie star, back in the 30s and 40s. His father was also a movie star and producer. But Douglas Fairbanks Jr. felt very strongly, before the U.S. entered the war, he felt very strongly that we should be doing more, the U.S. should be doing more to support the British in the fight against the Germans. He was very emphatic about that. So he decided to join the Navy, to help out in that cause. And he joined the Navy before we even entered the war. Think about that. A movie star leaves his lush environment, being a movie star, and joins the U.S. Navy before we even enter the war. Wow, good for him. And he was commissioned as a young naval officer, and he was treated like a young naval officer. For example, in reading about him, he served on a couple of U.S. Navy ships, and he got the worst duty, time of duty. He had the midnight to 5 a.m. duty on deck duty. So he was treated. He wasn't treated like a movie star. He was treated like a junior officer. So Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
Didn't the British have some deception on their own before we did?
Yes, sir. In fact, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., once he had these assignments on these ships, he then worked with the British as a liaison officer out of London. And he became very infatuated with, what the British were doing in their deception programs in the Mediterranean and North Africa and places like that. In fact, he went on a couple of missions with the British. And in one particular mission, it was on an island off the coast of Italy. Douglas Fairbanks was there, and the guy standing right next to him was shot and killed. And Douglas Fairbanks ended up, because of his very involved with the British deception program, he ended up getting a Silver Star for heroism. Silver Star, you got the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and then the Silver Star. So that's quite an honor that he received for that. Now, he did come back to London and wrote a memo to Washington, to the Pentagon, saying we ought to have some sort of deception unit put together. So that was one of the reasons that the Ghost Army came together, was his memo to Washington. Another person also said that, well, actually, he said that he started the Ghost Army. He's the one that came up with the Ghost Army. And he's over right on this other side, so if you'll step over here. Ralph Ingersoll. Now, he said that he was the one that came up with the idea for the Ghost Army, but everybody knew Ralph Ingersoll was a jokester. He exaggerated, so nobody really believed him. But he did play an important role. And while we're getting situated here, don't you just love these 40s pictures with a cigarette in the hand? You don't see that anymore, do you? Hardly. Anyway, Ralph Ingersoll, first of all, in civilian life, he was a journalist and an author. And he was drafted into the military at the start of World War II. He was drafted in the military at the age of 41. And he also worked with the British and their deception program in London. Now, he exaggerated. He said that he came up with the idea. He was involved in it, but nobody believed him. But he did play an important role. He actually worked with General Patton, 3rd Army Commanding General, sat in General Patton's tent over in France, talking to him and suggesting ways, I guess you don't talk to a general, suggest ways of how to, utilize the ghost army. And General Patton used to utilize the ghost army several different times during the march through Europe, Ralph Ingersoll. He got out of the service when the war was over, bought, I think it was 3 newspapers, so became an editor and publicist or whatever for these 3 newspapers. And then when he retired, he turned these 3 newspapers over to his son. And his son then came to St. Louis and started up the St. Louis Sun, which was in late 1989. I think it's September of 89, but it folded in April of 1990. I just want to talk about his son in connection to St. Louis. In fact, the first tour I did with the Ghost Army, there was an individual in the tour that remembered his son because he worked for the St. Louis Sun during his short time while I was here in St. Louis. Ralph Ingersoll. Okay, I wanted to step over here and look at one of the oral histories. These are 6 different oral histories from actual members of the 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops. I'm just going to play one of them, but at the end, if you're interested, I encourage you to come back. They're all very interesting. You'll have to come a little closer. This is the one I want to play that talks more about the sound recording and how they did that.
After my half-track, I told my children it's the biggest boom box you ever saw, but it played sounds of tanks in activity. Walter Banzer, fantastic, recorded these sounds, mixed them according to what we needed. Like crossing a bridge or traveling to try to make this sound very real. And this is all recorded on a wire. Remember, back there wasn't tape. And then we would play this to the Germans, probably in artillery position, which was a half mile or a mile. And they would then recognize that there was action, and they would send over an aircraft, a light aircraft. And they would see all these tanks from the air. This really looked real. And then they would bombard, fortunately over us, to the 603rd, puncture rubber tanks, and the enemy prepared continuously. Real action was taking place someplace else. Real action of our surrounding them. After this was all done, our part of it was all done. And this is the part I like, that's why we call it the Ghost Army. We could deflate all the rubber tanks and disappear. About 2 hours we were gone. That's probably why I'm still here and why many of my buddies are still here. We didn't have weapons to defend ourselves. We did have, under my seat in the half-track, were explosives. If this ever happened, we were told our orders were to destroy our equipment. But for some reason, this did not happen. I think we presented to them a very big, strong force. And we were out of there in every piece before anything like that happened. We slept away into the night and gone. That's the Ghost Army.
There we go. All right, we're going to step over here and talk about FM radios. Now this is an FM radio that they would use. It's an SCR 508, Signal Corps Radio 508. And how they would power these radios is with these small generators over here. Gas-operated generators would provide the power to operate the FM radios. Going back to manufacturing of the inflatables, that was done in the U.S. by companies like Goodyear Rubber, U.S. Rubber, several other companies. Teresa Reichert was one of the production individuals making the inflatable tanks. She was 16 years old. During the day, she would go to the factory, during the day, she would go to high school, and during second shift, she would make 49 cents an hour making these inflatables. Now, none of the workers were ever told the real reason these inflatables were being made. Again, it was top secret. And so the workers were told the inflatables were going to be used as target practice, to shoot at, and never told the real reason why the inflatables were being made. But Teresa Wright, 49 cents an hour, second shift. Wow. After all day in school. All right, 2 of the operations Initial operations they went on, once they got into Europe, in August of 44, Operation Whitney, this was mainly a radio operation. In other words, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, their radio operators pretended that they were 4 divisions, 3 infantry and 1 armored division. So we're talking, what, 50 to 60,000 soldiers, at least 250 tanks. They were pretending to be with their radio messaging. So they were deceiving the Germans that these 4 divisions were moving to the west. By the way, these were General Patton's divisions. 4 of these divisions were moving to the west in France, whereas the real divisions were very quietly moving to the east. They got into a position, the real divisions got into a position where they actually neutralized the German 7th Army, surprised them, and neutralized the German 7th Army and nullified 200,000 German troops. So quite a success. Next operation, Operation Brest, 5 days later. Brest is a port city in France, and so the U.S. and the Allies really wanted to get these ports because it was a lot more efficient to bring in ships and offload equipment, more troops, supplies at these ports versus ships coming in and trying to offload on the beaches of Normandy. Sometimes the bigger ships would have to unload the smaller ships, and then smaller ships would bring in the Normandy. So it was a lot more efficient if they could get these port cities. So they had Brest, port cities surrounded, the U.S. and the Allies had Brest surrounded, but they could not get the Germans to surrender. So they called in the 23rd, the Ghost Army, to bolster the attack force on Brest to try and get the Germans to surrender. So the Ghost Army pretended that they were an armored division, additional artillery units, things of that nature. Well, the Germans still did not surrender. But what it did was it caused the Germans to move many or some of their anti-tank weapons from where the anti-tank weapons were over to where the Ghost Army was. Thus, when the real attack occurred over here, they suffered less casualties because there was less anti-tank weapons. They know this is true because they captured, once the U.S. and the Allies captured Brest, they captured a German officer, and the German officer talked about they were facing an armored division over here where the Ghost Army was. It was actually the Ghost Army. You get that picture? Okay. Colonel Reeder, the head of the Ghost Army, he sent a report back to General Eisenhower and his staff in London saying that they were never able to get the Germans to surrender, but they were able to get the Germans to move some of their weapons, thus freeing up more of an open space for our attack on Brest. I got to tell you this quick story. It still tickles me. So I'm talking about this is Captain Reb here. And so I'm talking about Captain Reb, and a lady on a tour about 2 tours ago said, "Boy, he's a handsome guy." I said, "Well, that's a first." Anyway, by the way, he's one of the oral histories that are over there. So if you want to see an older version of Captain Reb, he's on the oral history over there. But anyway, Captain Reb, he was head of the combat engineers, the guys that provided the security and the equipment, the big trenches and ruts in the road and all that. Well, he headed up that company, and you can see he's a captain. He was a West Point graduate, I think January of '43. Anyway, there's a story when they were impersonating, he was impersonating an infantry regimental commander. So he had eagles on his shoulders. So now, if you're not familiar with the military rank system, in officers it goes lieutenant, second lieutenant, first lieutenant, then captain, then major, lieutenant colonel, then colonel. Eagles. So he's well above where these eagles than his real rank is, but he's impersonating, pretending to be a regimental commander. Well, he crossed paths with some of his West Point colleagues one day. And the West Point colleagues were amazed that he was a full colonel and they were still captains. And so on their way out, one of the West Point guys said to one of the sergeants in Reb's unit, said, "Hey, how did Reb ever become a full colonel?" And the sergeant lied to him and said, well, you know, sir, the war's going on. He was at the right place at the right time. So that's how he got to be a colonel, Captain Red. Over here, Operation Bettenberg. Bettenberg, now we're in Luxembourg. We've gone through France, now we're in Luxembourg, which borders France and Germany. And Bettenberg was an operation involved filling in a 70-mile gap. So temporarily, the Ghost Army pretended, I think it was an armored, they were pretending to be an armored division, filling in the 70-mile gap in the 3rd Army line. And they did that for 8 days. They tried to limit the number of days the Ghost Army was exposed, because the more time they were out there, the better chance the Germans would figure out that they're just a bunch of dummies. But seriously, you think about it, if the Germans knew that they were just a bunch of inflatables out there, and the only thing they had was 50 caliber machine guns, 70 miles, the Germans could have come right through there, overrun them, and perhaps even got to the rear of the 3rd Army. Scary. But anyway, they weren't able to do that. The Ghost Army was successful in deceiving the Germans for that 8 days, and finally they were replaced by an infantry division, as I recall, after that 8 days. So it was a very successful operation in Bettenberg. This is another inflatable. Again, it's just a replica. It's not the real thing. It's a replica of a 105 millimeter self-propelled howitzer. I know it looks like a tank. You want to call it a tank? I guess that's okay, but it's really a self-propelled howitzer, 105 millimeter. A tank inflatable. Well, a real tank weighs about 40 tons. 40 tons. A tank inflatable weighs about 93 pounds. So there's a story behind the tank inflatable, I got to tell you. When they were still in France, 2 French farmers got through the perimeter, and they noticed 4 GIs, 4 soldiers, picking up a tank inflatable. And the French farmers go, wow, how can they do this? You know. And so the guards by that time caught up to him and said, you got to get out of here. So the farmers said in broken French, how can they do this? And the guard says, oh, you know, Americans are very strong. Again, deceiving them and running out of the area. Then we are over here, Battle of the Bulge. Now we're into December 44, Operation Berlin's. They were impersonating the 75th Infantry Division, filling in for the Infantry Division before they were replaced by a real infantry division. And 4 hours later, 4 hours after they left the line, the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge. And the Bulge was bulging into the Allied line, pushing it back. It was the last, by the way, we're in Germany now, Glenn's. We're in Germany. This is a German last-ditch effort, counterattack, trying to change the tide of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. And it took over a month to push the Germans back to those original lines before the Bulge initiation occurred. It cost, in doing that month's period of time, it cost 19,000 American lives. So it was a horrific battle. But back to the Ghost Army. They left there 4 hours before that battle was launched. If they had been there 4 hours later, stayed there, they would have been easily overrun by the Germans, and we probably wouldn't be standing here talking about it today. But fortunately, they escaped that narrowly. Then Operation down here, name escapes me right now, Kodak. Operation Kodak. How many of you have seen the TV miniseries Band of Brothers? Okay, several of you, Band of Brothers. All right, well, Band of Brothers was about a company, Easy Company, an infantry company, as part of the 101st Airborne Division. And they were, the 101st Airborne Division, during the Battle of the Bulge, was surrounded up in Belgium, in the city of Bastogne. The whole division, including Easy Company, was surrounded up in Bastogne, Belgium. Well, Operation Kodak involved the Ghost Army impersonating, pretending to be 2 infantry divisions in reserve. So they were sending out messages that they were 2 infantry divisions in reserve. Whereas in reality, those 2 infantry divisions were actually moving up with other units to break up the encirclement around the 101st Airborne. So again, a successful operation because they did break up that encirclement and around the 101st Airborne and Easy Company. That's known. Most of you may be familiar with Morse code equipment. There was a lot of communications used it during World War II. Dying technology now, but anyway, each letter of the alphabet has dots and dashes, like international distress signal. S is 3 dots, and O is 3 dashes, and then another 3 dots. SOS. Anyway, gentleman was just telling me they taught Morse code in his high school when he was in Germany. My dad was trained on Morse code during World War II. He was a Morse code operator. As a kid, I can remember my dad walking around going dot, dash, dash, dot. Had no clue what he was talking about. Now I have some clue. All right. I want to point out the patches. When they took on and impersonated the unit they were pretending to be, they would wear patches for that unit. And that was part of the special effects. Besides stenciling the vehicles, they would actually wear the unit's patches. And if they didn't get enough of the real patches, the artists in the unit would make the patches for the unit with canvas and stenciling on there. For example, here's the big red one, 1st Infantry Division. The Indian heads, the 2nd Infantry Division. I was with the 2nd Infantry Division, not World War II. 3 to 76, and other divisions. And if you listen to the oral history for Dick Syracuse, Lieutenant Dick Syracuse, he talks about he changed patches so many times on his uniform that the sleeves started to fall off. In fact, Dick Syracuse tells a story in his oral history that one of his friends, he crossed paths with one of his friends, not in the 23rd, several times as they were moving through Europe. And every time his friend saw Dick, he had a different patch on, which was really odd. And so his friend finally said to him by the 3rd time, he said, "Dick, what are you doing? I mean, every time I see you, you got a different patch on." And Dick Syracuse said, "Oh man, I'm just screwing up and they keep transferring me around." His friend said, "Dick, you better be careful. I'm going to put a rifle in your hands and send you to the front." So, anyway, war turns deadly. They did suffer casualties. They actually only suffered 3 killed in action during this whole affair. One of the individuals killed by a German grenade, and 2 more were killed on one particular day when they were moving off the line. They were loading in the trucks, so they were kind of vulnerable in that they were all grouped together. And so German artillery came in on them, and 2 more were killed, and another, I think it was 15 more were, either 15 or 17 were wounded that day. Jacob Goldberg was a medic assigned to the 23rd, and he stayed right there with the wounded, tended to them, even though artillery rounds were coming in, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for heroism, which is 4th, Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star. Jacob Goldberg. In fact, his Bronze Star medal is over there on display near where we started the tour today. War turns deadly. By the way, Harold Lanor, another member of the 23rd, he was wounded and he had shrapnel. He had to be sent to Paris to have the shrapnel removed surgically from his body. And while he was in convalescing, after having that shrapnel removed, Picasso, the sculptor, artist, came in to visit the convalescent troops, and he struck up a real conversation with Harold because Harold was thinking about being an artist. And so Picasso invited Harold when he got well enough to come visit him in his studio, which he did. And then Harold, after visiting Picasso in the studio, wrote his wife and said, "I know I want to be an artist. This is what I want to do." Kind of a nice story. In the last operation, Operation Pearson, right over here, it was their last operation. It was their largest and most successful operation. I got to hand it to these guys. They improved every time. If you read about what they did, they got better and better. So their most successful was their last operation in March of 45. And March, they had over 600 inflatables that they deployed. 600 inflatables. Man, that's a lot. Anyway, They were pretending to be along the Rhine River. So they're in Germany now, in the enemy's country. So they're along the Rhine River, and they were pretending to be two infantry divisions. Two infantry divisions, probably 20 to 30,000 soldiers. So they were pretending to be these two infantry divisions, the 79th and 30th, as I recall, that they were going to move across the Rhine River and attack across the Rhine River. All right, so they had sound effects of, boats, getting in and out of boats and things like that. And so, but the real two divisions were about 20 miles to the north along the Rhine River. So when the attack occurred, the real two divisions went over, and they suffered, I think it was 17 casualties. Now, any casualty is bad, but 17 in a situation like that is a miracle. And I choose the word miracle because Dick Syracuse in his oral history used that word. It's a miracle there was only 17 casualties. Because when you think about it, you got, 20, 30,000 soldiers getting in boats, crossing a river against an entrenched enemy, and only suffering 17 casualties is amazing. It's a miracle. They did capture a German headquarters in Operation Garrison, and in the headquarters there was a map, and it showed the 79th Infantry Division exactly where the Ghost Army was. And the 30th wasn't even on the map. So it was a very successful operation saving lives. One historian estimated that the Ghost Army saved over 30,000 American lives. 30,000. That's like two infantry divisions. Anyway. Superstar fashion designer was a member of the Ghost Army. And I got curious of why he was a fashion designer, so in reading about his history, Bill Blass, his father died when he was a young boy, and his mother owned a dressmaking shop. And so to make ends meet, he started working with his mother in the dressmaking shop. And that's why he became a fashion designer. But he was part of the Ghost Army. And of course, he got out of the service at the end of the war, went on with fashion design, created fashions for Jackie Kennedy, Nancy Reagan, people like that. Ellsworth Kelly. The reason why I home in on Ellsworth Kelly is because some of his artwork is over at the St. Louis Art Museum. I used to live in Springfield. St. Louis Art Museum. And in fact, this last week I was over there looking at his artwork. It's stored now, but you can make an appointment to see his artwork. There is a sculpture of his out on the patio of the St. Louis Art Museum. It's there, you can see it anytime. I want to talk about the gold medal, Congressional Gold Medal. It's the highest honor that our Congress can bestow on any unit or individual. Only like 184 of them have been awarded to people since we became a country in 1776. And so the gold medal was bestowed on the Ghost Army. And first of all, going back to the end of World War II, the government kept the secrecy, top secrecy designation on the 23rd until 1996. And the reason they kept it secret is because we had the Cold War going on and all that stuff, and they thought we might have another war in Europe. And so they kept it secret until 96 when they finally said, yes, there was a Ghost Army. So in 1996 then, a group headed up by Rick Beyer, who wrote a book about the Ghost Army. In fact, this book is for sale upstairs in case you're interested. In fact, Rick Beyer will be here in St. Louis on the 27th of April to talk about the Ghost Army if you're interested. But anyway, this group headed up by Rick Beyer started in 1996. They worked like 9 years continuous trying to get Congress to approve the Congressional Gold Medal. It takes 2/3 of the members of the House and 2/3 of the members of the Senate to approve the Congressional Gold Medal. They were able to do this after over a 9-year period of time, which is amazing to get those folks up there to agree on anything.
Yeah.
But he was able to do that, he and his team. So in 2022, President Biden signed a law authorizing the Congressional Gold Medal. And then last March, a year ago this month, they were awarded the gold medal up at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Sadly, only 3 members of the original 1,100-member unit were able to attend. and there's only 7 of them that are still alive, from what I understand. So, but at least they got recognition finally after all of these years of Congressional Gold Medal. Bringing it back to St. Louis for just a second, Edward Boscia. This is some of his artwork. Edward Boscia was born in New Jersey, went to Pratt Art Institute, served in the Ghost Army, came to St. Louis, and he was a professor of fine arts for over 30 years at Washington University. And some of his artwork is over at Kemper Art Museum on the campus of Washington University. Well, that concludes the tour. Are there any questions?
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
To move all of this equipment, they had to take the inflatable down.
Yes, ma'am.
And do they put it on a truck, or do they carry it, or how do they move it?
Great question. No, they put on trucks. They have real trucks, not inflatable trucks. In fact, they tested various forms of what became the inflatables. For example, like in parades, sometimes you see little like Volkswagens with a float around it. They looked at that, but they figured inflatables were a lot easier to move because they could deflate them, throw them in the back of the truck, move to the next operation, get the compressors hooked up to the inflatable
So
tubes.
what time period would that be?
It depended on the operation. It could be days or weeks, depending upon where they were needed, the mission.
Yeah, how long will this display be here, and where will it go next?
Well, it depended on the mission. Sometimes, the max they were ever on a mission was like 11 days from what I recall.
No, how long will this display
display?
be here?
Sorry. This display is here until Memorial Day.
Memorial Day?
Yes, sir.
Then where to go from there?
It goes to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks for bringing this up, because this is a traveling exhibition from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. And it came here in September, October of last year. It will be here, as I mentioned, until Memorial Day, and then it moves on to Fort Wayne, Indiana. It'll be replaced, in case anybody's thinking, by what will come next. On June 19th, I think it is, there's another traveling exhibition coming here called the Tuskegee Airmen, and which is the first African-American aviator unit in World War II. So that'll be here on June 19th for about 3 months. Yes, ma'am.
If I wanted to tell my kids about this exhibit, would they be able to get a tour?
Yes, you can. Yes.
They
In
have to
fact,
schedule that ahead of time, or are there certain times for tours?
they're both. You can schedule a tour, just like Jennifer did for this tour, through the Missouri Historical Society. You can schedule a tour, or on the first Saturday of every month, there's a free tour of the 2 main galleries upstairs and of this gallery, and then also a tour of outside. At noon on the first Saturday of every month, there's a tour outside. It talks about the building, the Court of Honor, a lot to talk about there. Then at 1 o'clock, there's a tour of the 2 main galleries upstairs. They're pretty permanent. And then at 2 o'clock, there's a tour of what's ever down here. First Saturday of every month, free tour. And then you can schedule a tour through the Missouri Historical Society.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Well, I hope you learned something.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.